Would you like me to repeat the date and time?
Yes, please.
Good morning. Welcome to the September 3rd, 2024 work session of the McMinnville Water and Light Commission. We'll turn things over to our general manager, John Dietz, right away to introduce the topic. Thank you.
Sure. So this is a series of work sessions we've been working on. And so I'd like to introduce Scott Sims with the Public Power Council, the CEO and Executive Director, and I will turn it over to Scott for his presentation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. Public Power Council actually has deep roots with McMinnville because when the council got started in 1966, many of the original meetings were actually out here in McMinnville, and some of the original directors had long time chair roles in the organization. So in its inception in 1966, almost 60 years ago, McMinnville is actually the center of that, which I think is a pretty cool piece of history. So I really appreciate being here. I'm going to embarrass John a little bit today by telling you that he is one of the officers at the Public Power Council. So we'll get into this in a moment, but we're led by a 21-member board. It is a working board, so we put them to task in between our monthly meetings. We have our monthly meetings actually this week, later on in Poland. And so John is one of 6 officers, and that means that they head up a work committee of other executives. And so we have him on long-term planning. And one of the issues that we deal with on a regular basis is some reforms at Bonneville Power Administration, the power marketing agency, where we get a bulk of the power for the Pacific Northwest public utilities, trying to get their transmission practices more in line with industry standard and getting executives matched up, which has been really powerful to have John matched up with those utility executives at BPA, because as you all know, he keeps his receipts. So being able to have the organization, the utility actually share the things that you're seeing on the ground here at McMinnville, the struggles that you face, the challenges that you have working with your federal partners, he's been able to bring those right to the forefront and really explain to folks why there are challenges and what could be done, what could be fixed, right? It's not just about being a canary in the coal mine, but figuring out strategies on how to fix them. So just really hats off to John on being on that committee and being an officer with us, and we're really glad to have him. And he's often a voice of reason in the room, and also he's willing to speak up, as you guys, as you all know. So, well, let's jump into it. Today, John asked me to speak on a couple of topics. We have a lot of initiatives that we manage at PPC. So I was trying to figure out a way to do a creative update. I thought it's a swirl of events. There's a swirl of things going on at your utility, at the utility level, that are challenging. At the city level, there's a lot of challenges that the organization faces, and certainly on a regional level, at the level that we work at, we're still certainly seeing that as well. So just again, a little bit about us. We're a spinoff of the Northwest Power Association, the more technical arm. We basically, because we do so much analytics and data, they spun us off back in 1966, as I mentioned earlier. We focus really on the federal Columbia River power system. So basically everything that deals with the Bonneville Power Administration and its partners, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, also Energy Northwest, the folks who manage the one nuclear power plant in the region. So we represent about more than 100 public power entities across 6 states, those very small utilities to very large ones, and everything in between. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got this 21-member executive committee that we always remind everybody is a working board. This is not just a coffee klatch. These folks come together monthly, but they report on what they've been working on, the progress they're making, the challenges they're facing, the opportunities we see, those kinds of things. And I think hopefully you've seen, since McMinnville is a member of PPC, hopefully you've seen our materials and our work on rates and contracts, on the rate cases with Bonneville, on the fish issues, other investment things that BPA is involved in, like basically 1/4 to 1/3 of your rates cover fish and wildlife mitigation expenses. So not a small amount of funding that goes to that program. So I like to think of us as kind of the shareholder for BPA. We're there to protect Bonneville and make sure that there aren't folks who have grand ideas for repurposing it, but we also are there to hold it accountable and make sure that they're performing to the standards that are set forth, which again is why it's great to have John involved in the long range planning committee. So just moving along, I would say if people try to ask us what we do, we really do try to focus on BPA's competitiveness. We really are trying to both reduce costs and also boost revenues, but it is, I put this asterisk in after a couple of times when folks have asked us, so is this an all costs exercise? No, it's not. We try to embody or embrace the value of BPA. For instance, you could shave further funds off of BPA from its labor standpoint, but then of course you worry about the organization being able to have continuity. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining that value, but in a proper manner. It's not unlike your operations at your utility or your city, right? You want to make sure that you're being prudent, but also that you're not running the organization to a point where it can't function. So that's really what we're about, is trying to really focus on BPA's overall competitiveness, and everything that we work on is basically mapping to reducing costs or reducing revenues. Again, with that overall arching goal of maintaining value. So what I think the things that we really bring to the table is that, because Bonneville is a very large federal agency that covers 6 states, and no one utility can really reign supreme over, what should be done for rates or what should be done for policy, that kind of thing. We try to pull everybody together and really do that sort of mix of hearing the different voices and finding the different perspectives, and then charting a path that's meaningful. I think some organizations struggle to find a cohesion across everybody, and then you can't actually get anywhere. And I think for us, we try to get as many as possible to get a majority, but we're never going to get 100%. That's where John and the team have been really instrumental in saying, we've heard you, we feel your perspective, but we need to vote on this issue, or we need to carry this forward. So we have very strong directive, I think, from our collective to invest in those 21 members of the executive committee so we can have solid policy outcomes. That means we're able to go do things in DC, we're able to do things here in the region with a very clear purpose, because the organizations have all come together collectively as one public power. So some of the swirl today that John wanted me to talk about is, and again, just because of lack of maybe end of the day, trying to figure out a good title, but I think the swirl sort of seems to fit, right? You guys have your own swirl here in McMinnville, just in terms of all the things that are going on around us, right? Things are never getting easier. So we've got BPA's potential entrance into day-ahead markets. We'll talk a little bit about that in the wholesale market level, so you can understand a little bit of the details there. Modernizing the Columbia River Treaty, had some new developments on that front. It felt like Groundhog Day for several years, but actually we're seeing some progress there. And then last is the U.S. government's 1214 agreement. This is an agreement between certain states and tribes in the region with Bonneville involved, and it will have implications down the road. We want to make sure to have folks understand. I'll just pause there and see if that's going to work. If anybody has any questions at this point, or any thoughts? Okay, great. All right, good. And how long time do we have? About an hour or so?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
8 o'clock.
Okay, good. I'll leave time then for sure for some questions. Well, first of all, so what is a regional transmission organization? What is an RTO? What is an organized market? There are several RTOs across the country that we can look at that really give us examples of how an RTO, or regional transmission organization, works. And there are different flavors of them, but essentially utilities will ultimately provide their resources and their transmission and their generation into a centralized function, and then it's dispatched over a larger footprint. So it's really about trying to create that coordination and improved information flow, so you can optimize transmission, you can optimize generation, and ultimately reduce the costs for the end use consumer. Now, what we always say is that's kind of the larger big picture of the goal. How you get there is very tricky, and that's what we're watching here in the Northwest as some different ideas come ahead for a future market here in the West. Yeah,
Scott, real quick question. Looking at the map, does TVA have a regional transmission organization?
TVA is within some of the footprint of the RTOs out there in the Midwest.
So part of it, not all.
Part of it.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
What is CVO?
I'm sorry, Tennessee Valley Authority.
Tennessee.
Another,
It's another power marketing
Yeah.
agency, but
they have
4
dams and
nuclear and coal.
Dams, coal, and nuclear, and natural gas. They're a little bit different of a power marketing agency, that they're semi privatized, so they essentially don't have they have higher compensation rates than the federal salary rates that Bonneville Power Administration has. So yeah, good question. These are some different kinds of organized market types. So when I talked about regional transmission organization, that is sort of when you've gone to the place where you've put all of your assets into a centralized dispatch and operations paradigm. And then you can walk back from there incrementally. And so we've got an energy imbalance market or real time. That's where some of the utilities in the Northwest have been experimenting with this. And that's really, you think about a sort of last minute, we'll use like a great grocery store example. You've got an abundance of extra tomatoes that you don't need the day of. And you're thinking, well, these tomatoes aren't going to last forever. We put them at a decent price and away they go, right? So you found a buyer for the tomatoes, right? But that's a very real time kind of a thing. If you look a day ahead, that's the market where you're essentially bidding or looking at what you can offer and what somebody needs, and then trying to match that up. And that's really the focused area that we're looking at right now for both I'll get into it in a moment, but the Southwest Power Pool has an offering called the Markets Plus option, and then CAISO, which is in California, has the EDAM product, the day ahead market product. Essentially, what that is you've got different power plants and different user groups in an area. And what you're trying to do is optimally match anything that you might have as a resource you can offer to them and something that they need. So you ideally are trying to ultimately match that desire for electricity and the ability to supply it. And there's an algorithm that basically dispatches the unit that is the cheapest to do that, right? So you think about a collective of electricity production resources that are on one side of the ledger and a bunch of consumers on the other side of the ledger. And basically you've got this powerful computer algorithm that is going to balance those two and dispatch the units that are the lowest cost, that have maybe a certain resource profile. So maybe you'll lower emissions, those kinds of things. It's all basically programmed into the system, and it happens at the speed of light. So it can be a fantastic paradigm, but as I said a second ago, it really does matter about the design and the governance and lots of devil in the details, which is the issues that we're working through right now. John, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to.
Although I think I was going to add, there's one key that you need for this transmission.
Yes, that's right.
If you don't have the transmission, you can't get the electrons where you need it.
That's right. Yeah, basic physics still
applies.
still apply. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So really, again, just in terms of how an organized market works, you can get really, really down in the weeds fast, which I'm trying to avoid doing here today. But essentially, it is a commodity. Electricity is a commodity that can be bought and sold. One of the powerful elements of the Bonneville Power Administration and the hydro projects it manages is that's one of the largest batteries, if you will. Water behind a dam is ultimately stored electricity. So you really have this amazing resource that can be a participant in the market. An example of a resource that's more difficult to manage is wind power. I live in the Columbia River Gorge. It was very windy yesterday, but the days before that, it was very calm. And so there was no wind production, even though it was very hot over Saturday and Sunday, very calm. But then the wind really ramped up yesterday. It was a much cooler day. So that's an example of sort of the resource that may or may not show up. Now, it's great if you can take advantage of that resource. And that's the way that these algorithms are set up, is to see that the wind is spinning up and to grab that wind and put it on the grid and then de-optimize other resources and have them wait, if you will. So it can work out tremendously well. But again, you have to make sure that you're operating the system in terms of its design, in terms of its governance correctly, and that folks are getting fairly compensated. If you've invested in a system and then you're not getting compensated for it to participate, eventually you're going to be out of business. So,
and that's where you get into the challenge, because the hydro system provides you two things: the energy and the capacity, which the wind doesn't have, because it's an intermittent resource. So essentially you have no capacity with that wind. It's just there and then it's gone. So you always have to have another resource with the wind or solar or some other intermittent source.
yeah, very good point, John. If you think about the wind suddenly ramping up and we're building more and more wind and building more and more solar, that is all terrific. But we do know, especially living out here in McMinnville, the sun doesn't always shine.
Yeah.
And wind can be variable. Out here you get different winds. You're not an overly windy area compared to some areas like the Gorge, where there's a lot of wind fleet deployed. But what you worry about is that moment where there's no wind and there's no solar. And what is the resource that's going to pick it up? That's where hydro often will come in, natural gas can come in, nuclear. And so we want to make sure when those resources do come in, when there's a dearth or a lack of other resources, that they're being properly compensated for that service. As John pointed out, the capacity service, the ability to jump in and help. Yeah.
Does nuclear help as much as hydro? Because it doesn't.
It
cover
doesn't
that.
ramp as much, but given that we need so many electrons in our environment, having nuclear there is very helpful, but it is more of a baseload resource. Now they are experimenting with units that can be, brought up and brought
Okay.
down faster. CGS, the main nuclear power plant, the only nuclear power plant in the Northwest, has had advances in recent years of being able to move a little bit,
Okay.
but the most dynamically scheduled really are hydro and natural gas. Yeah.
And so when you think about that, wind, the event we had in January, there was no wind generation.
Yeah.
And typically when we get like heat waves or the cold, we don't have wind with them. So that's a challenge for those kind of resources.
Yeah, very good point. Yes. Go again.
What are all of the non-intermittent resources?
Sure.
Wave, nuclear, coal,
Coal,
Gas.
natural gas,
natural gas,
Hydro.
water, hydro.
and then you've got geothermal.
Mhm.
Yeah. And all those, every resource, it's like your financial portfolio. If you think about it, you want to have it diversified, right? And ideally, so every resource has got its pluses and minuses. I mean, there are definitely times when hydro is constrained with, if you've got the middle of winter, everything's frozen up, you don't have as much flow or low water years. But certainly every resource has got its challenges. And of course, we know the state of Oregon does not allow any new construction of natural gas plants. So no nuclear, no natural gas, no coal allowed, and no nuclear. So really you're left with what's existing as a legacy fleet. So natural gas units that are existing, the coal has all been ramped out. And natural gas, of course, you can't build that. And the nuclear, I think, is still off the table as of 1980, I believe, voter initiative. So really what you've got left for state of Oregon is hydro. Yeah, in terms of that capacity resource.
When that,
And then wave, which is coming on. And then, if there were to be geothermal, potentially. Yeah.
with the restrictions on nuclear, if there was more of a organized market available, would we be able to purchase nuclear?
Mhm.
Okay.
Just
What's
can't
the
build.
regulation? What was the 1980
I
regulation?
believe the 1980 regulation was, except for, just pull this out of the back of my mind, but I think except for scientific or study purposes, no nuclear power facilities can be built. No.
It's initiative.
So I believe
It's
it
a
was a
state-
voter initiative that was in
statewide
1980.
initiative,
It was largely around Portland General Electric's
Trojan.
former Trojan nuclear power plant. So I think that's where the state decided to say, or the citizens of the state said no more. But I think, certainly, I think there are conversations happening about Oregon's future energy strategy and some new developments that are happening in small modular reactors where they are a smaller modular electric producing unit that could have some opportunity. So I think that's something that folks are interested in looking at, and we'll see where that goes. Yeah, great
Thank
question. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move forward a little bit deeper into the organized market world, just to give you a sense. I mentioned this earlier. So CAISO EDAM, this is basically a project in which you have a state of California run market that is getting larger in terms of the recruitment and other folks that it is sort of pulling into this day ahead market. And it's got a proposed go live of 2026. You can see that, as I mentioned earlier, all the resources and loads and transmission will be optimized by the market. John aptly pointed out earlier, it does take transmission. There is good transmission connectivity between the Pacific Northwest and California and the desert Southwest. It could be always boosted. We're always hitting that limit of what we can transfer. And one of the things that we're really watching there carefully is just the leaning, which means that you've got to make sure that you're not unduly asking others for resources, that you're not sort of putting others at a risk of loss while you're pulling in resources yourself. So it's really about that equity test of, is this flowing correctly? are folks, are you creating unintended consequences across your footprint? Those are the kinds of things you really want to watch very carefully. So you get a good sense of kind of that EDAM footprint there across the West with a patchwork of utilities that have signed up. So Pacific Core, Portland General Electric, and then Idaho and Idaho Power and NV Energy, which is a subsidiary of Pacific Core. They're both indicating leanings, but they're not fully committed yet.
Do you have a glossary of public power acronyms?
Yes, we do. Yeah, actually we do on our website, and it's one we need to probably we need to increase because there are so many acronyms in this industry. Yeah. So CAISO is the California Independent System Operator. SPP is Southwest Power Pool. So
EDAM.
and EDAM is extended day ahead market. So that's that looking ahead piece for purchases. So SPP Markets Plus is the one that is based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is one that BPA and several PPC members have indicated a real interest in developing further for this day ahead market opportunity. One of the things that's, I think, tremendous about the SPP Markets Plus option is that it is very similar in culture to the Pacific Northwest. So you remember at the start of my presentation, I said we have 6 states that are in the Bonneville system, and we have 6 states that we work with member utilities in them. And that takes a lot of cooperation. It takes a lot of coordination and collaboration across folks. Folks have got to, give compromise. And they're used to working in that kind of environment. Folks do not love state supremacy. And I think one of the issues that we deal with the CAISO market is that it's not it's no fault of its own, but it is a creature of the California legislature, and therefore it is essentially always going to have, until it potentially changes governance, it's always going to have benefits for its citizens first, and then everyone else next. And so
We saw that in
we
January.
did see that in January, and that is an ongoing concern, something that we have flagged and have been working on for several months. We actually have, strong belief that CAISO's EDAM offering and SPP's Markets Plus offering together has actually been a pretty good thing, because they have both been aware of each other. So they're both trying to really develop their markets with the idea that they've got to really do things, got to work harder. It's not unlike in McMinnville having 2 businesses that are very similar in what they offer, and you're a citizen buying services, and they've got to really make sure they're on their toes to offer the best, because no competitor down the street, right? So this is a very similar kind of environment, and we have really, I think, benefited from the CAISO EDAM market being better than otherwise, and same with SPP's Market Plus. But the one thing I would say about Markets Plus that I think, again, that's really, really critical for us is that they are operated as a consortia of about 14 states. So they are used to this compromise, they're used to collaboration, they're used to building their both their design and their governance with those multiple states in mind.
Excuse me, Scott.
Yeah.
Are we gonna have to, or are utilities or BPA gonna have to choose one or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. They are ultimately, as I said earlier, you've got, like Pacific Core and PGE have basically said they're going to go into EDAM. I think that for us, we're really, really supporting Bonneville going further towards SPP Markets Plus. They've indicated a leaning. There's a lot of things that still need to be worked out in both. So there's some folks, like I mentioned earlier, MW Energy, that's still not quite sure what they're going to do. Puget Sound Energy up in Seattle is very strong on SPP Markets Plus. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to have a patchwork of folks going for one or the other market. And what we can talk about a little bit later, again, try not to go too in the weeds, but that's called, when you do that, they're called seams. Essentially, they match up to each other. And I think there's been a lot of discussion lately about seams being the boogeyman, but really seams happen across the country. As I mentioned earlier, when you saw those images of the other RTOs that exist across the country, they match up and they've got seams all the time. So they're really used to working with the seams issues. And will you get the very, very most value out of, sort of a patchwork system? No. But do you also want to make sure you have a system that people feel comfortable with? And the answer is yeah, I think yes. So the bottom line is, can you still deliver solid benefits to the end use consumer? because that's really what this is all about, but also have protections in place so that you're not doing unintended consequences. You're not committing the hydro system, for instance, from a low cost region to a higher cost region and suddenly raising your own costs. That's the thing you gotta really watch.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
Follow. I think I read that Oregon's governor and legislature, maybe not the legislature, the governor is leaning toward the CAISO system. What control does the state of Oregon have over this decision?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we are seeing more and more folks who don't actually run the electric system having opinions about what markets should be gone into. And I think that there's that old saying that there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And so I think right now it's really important for the utilities to understand what they have a need for resources and what they're looking at from their rate standpoint and letting them make those decisions. For us in the Bonneville system, I think what we've clearly seen is that there's a concern about going to the CAISO market in which we could see that higher cost region ultimately washing out with our lower cost region. And some folks would say we're going to see more and more renewables potentially deployed writ large across across the territory. And that may be true or may not. We don't know. I mean, as John said earlier, we are physically constrained. So there's a lot of pushback on new wind sites, on new solar. I mean, there is some pushback from folks who worry about those big development projects happening in their neighborhoods. So will that come to fruition? We don't know. But one thing we're worried about is this equity transfer or this transfer from a low cost region.
But what impact does what the governor wants have on this decision? Is it a federal decision and
it's a great question.
Voice or
yeah, it's very much a political one. It's very much a political impact. I mean, I think that's why you see folks getting involved at the political level. And who knows what will come of that.
The challenge is that, like Scott said, is, low cost resources in the Northwest, high cost in California. And the concern is that California is going to want those low cost resources.
No, I understand the problem, but my question really is,
What influences do they have?
yeah, what impact does what the state of Oregon want
It's
have on this decision?
so ultimately BPA is going to make the decision, but obviously there's a lot of pressure from the PUCs and the governors of Oregon and Washington on BPA trying to go to the California market, where the utilities have the concern of losing our low cost resources and the governance issue, because the governance issue basically is saying, hey, California has control, and do we want to give control of our resources to California?
And why do the political leaders in Washington and Oregon think it's a good idea, or why do they say it's a good idea to give control of California?
Well, I think what you've seen is some policy similarity of California spreading to Oregon and Washington, and some desire to be probably very similar to that. But we haven't seen some of those. I mean, California has been leading on some areas, but they also have been retrenching on others where they've worried that they've deployed renewables too quickly and pulled back on other resources too much. And they do have the highest rates on the West Coast. So that is as a collective. So that's a concern as well. Are we headed that direction? Now, politically, there's a lot of folks who are probably using this as potentially a little bit of a trading card, for other policies and politics, et cetera. So for us, we get back to what our organization is charged with, is really doing the data and analytics. Because I want to ultimately be in a boardroom like this one, where we say we went to a certain market for these reasons, and to really pencil it out and to say these are the risks that we were facing in the other market, and these are and then so it's not decided fully yet. We've still got a lot to do, but that's where we're trying to aim is get out of the politics and get back to the data and the analytics, which ultimately, again, you should be able to go to a citizen in McMinnville and explain to them. It may take a while because it's a lot to sort of digest, but be able to say, this is why we chose this, because we think this offers better value for you, and it also protects you in the system you've invested in.
So think about it. I look at it this way. You've got the investor-owned utilities that have higher rates than the consumer owns. And so what are people looking at, or the governor, or politicians, is, oh, well, this is going to save the investor-owned utilities money, but it's going to raise our costs. And so is that really?
Okay, so this will save, using California would save the IOUs money.
Well, yeah, I mean, potentially they don't have to build more resources. So they're really
Right.
looking at how can they, and they're needing resources. So we know that Pacificor and PGE have more fossil fuels in their
Right.
portfolios than our public utilities do in Oregon, right? So they get most of their power from Bonneville Power Administration, the public utilities. The other utilities have got coal, natural gas, et cetera. So they've got higher costs. So they're looking for anything they can find in the market. So going to the CAISO market and that connectivity between the two states makes.
So that's the reason that, and so the SPP markets don't have access to those resources.
Well, they have a whole different resource mix, and they do, I mean, they do have some coal and natural gas in their portfolio, but they're also building out, they have built already a really large wind fleet that is different timing than our wind fleet, and also SPP's time of day, just because they're a different time zone. So the gorge wind in the Northwest shows up differently than the
Okay.
wind in the Midwest. And we do need to solve the transmission connectivity issue. There's a lack of transmission between the two places. But again, these are all things that we're in that development world, saying what's going to be potentially mapping out in the next 5 years, et cetera. So, there's pluses and minuses for both markets. And what we're really trying to do is really cut through that political, horse trading element and really get into the brass tacks of what each market could potentially bear for benefits.
Thank you.
You
Sorry.
bet. No, that's exactly why we're here today. So no problem at all. Well, let's just, oh, yes.
Go back.
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to explain what RAP is?
Oh,
Yeah, and I also just want to point out it's about 7:30, and
Yeah,
I know you said we had 3 agendas.
Yeah, we're gonna go a little bit faster through them. That's
Okay.
good. Yeah, markets is always a little bit more, it's always a little more of a deeper dive. Yeah. Yeah, so RAP is the Western Resource Adequacy Program, and RAP is that's another defining difference between SPP Markets Plus and CAISO. RAP is really making sure that folks who essentially come to the party have got resources and have got the ability to be a participant and not a drag on the system, if you will. And so the CAISO system does actually not require, it's not part of the RAP program. It does not have that requirement, which is another element. So you think about sort of inviting people to a party and you say, remember to bring something, a beverage, remember to bring a little food item. And that's sort of like the idea with SPP Markets Plus and RAP. You're showing up with resources. The CAISO one is maybe a little bit more about empty-handed, just come as you will, and was hopefully figured out. Hopefully there'll be enough for everybody.
2001.
Right.
So that
We have had energy challenges with California in past years. There are times when California has been resource rich and they have helped us with supply, but more often than not, we are usually supplying California with more of what we've got to send south to them. But yeah, that's another defining element here. It's going to try to just speed us ahead a little bit. So I think I've mentioned some of this, but there is going to be, some kind of a market in the future. So the question is, how does the federal system potentially participate? We think that there's, that good opportunity for the additional low-cost resources if we can get that mapped out correctly. There could be more efficient use of transmission between the regions, which is something we can always use because the build out is just becoming really, really difficult to expand the system. Excuse me. And then really the market could become a mechanism for better delivering BPA's products and services. We've already seen California right now, even just in the trading environment that we have, we're able to share hydro at a time when the sun goes down and the wind is not blowing in California and desert Southwest, but it's still very hot. The pavement's been baking all day. People still are running their air conditioners. We're seeing a really great market for hydro when we can go in and provide that evening resources for cooling. So that's a good thing. Excuse me, I'm just gonna take a little sip here and throw it.
And also, I'd probably add also the capacity in that as well.
Right.
We should be compensated for that as well.
Exactly. Bottom line is that really solid market design and solid governance are critical. So let's think about anything else. Think about like a business plan for an organization. If its business plan is really strong, but it also has strong governance, you're setting yourself up really well. If you have poor market design, but you have good governance, you can go fix your market design. If you have poor market design and poor governance, you're in a bad place. All right, just moving forward here a little bit. I think I've talked a little bit about these, just some challenges, some advantages and challenges. So the current governance structure is a real challenge for CAISO, the statutory responsibility to California first and foremost. CAISO kind of leads the process, and they're kind of their operator and they're a participant in the market. So that's a little bit of a fuzzy line there about how they can both participate and they oversee the market. And then there's definitely some inconsistent pricing around congestion. So when you think about like trying to get a resource from one place to the next, and you've got transmission that's holding it up because you can only get so much through. Think about it like a crowded freeway. That's where we're starting to see some challenges there in the design, is how that works. The advantages are that they have had good experience in the energy imbalance market, so that real-time market. And they do have a big footprint, and they do have that connectivity to us that we've talked about before. On the SPP Markets Plus side, again, I've said, advantage is multi-state governance, very much participatory policy development framework. We very much, our staff are involved in helping shape SPP Markets Plus. We can actually point to things that we have suggested that have carried through. It is very good with that price formation piece. That's the part about folks getting the right price signal for the resources they're bringing to the table. They've got this consistent resource adequacy program participation, as we called that before, the RAP program. Some of those challenges are there is going to be probably a higher initial implementation cost, and the market footprint issue, as mentioned earlier. These seams could have some impacts in terms of lowering the overall value. But again, if you're looking for a long-term investment, which is what we typically like to see in our industry, we like to look at, because it's such a capital intensive business, we like to look at things that are going to be paying off in the long term. This is probably going to be, I think, in current design, a better play. So if we don't do anything, there's also a chance that we'll have problems. So we're really in a place where we need to think about CAISO EDAM, SPP Markets Plus, but the no market option is definitely challenging because everybody's going to be going to essentially one or the other. And so what you really worry about is a risk of liquidity. So you think about, if everybody is, so I'm trying to think, if everybody's got a Costco membership on one side and they've got like another grocery store membership on the other, you've got to basically make a choice because there's nobody else to get groceries from, so I'm trying to think of different analogies here, but real time. But that risk of liquidity is a worrisome one. Even though Bonneville's system is very valuable and has a lot of capacity resource, you could be potentially forced into a place where your resource, just because you have no options, you have no leverage, you've got to play by their rules, one or the other. So I think we're really going to be in a place where we're going to have to choose. And Bonneville, like I said, seems to be leaning toward SPP Markets Plus. I think we've been helping them get there. So, okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of where we're at with the markets. More to come later this winter, probably into the spring is when you'll start to see some more news about Bonneville and their analysis as they're working to analyze both market options. And we'll stay plugged in on that. And John will stay plugged in with us as we continue to work on that going forward.
So I think I saw for the Market Plus that like 2027, is that what
Yep.
you said? So is this so we're still several years
Yeah.
out from something ultimately getting.
Yeah, you're
decided?
you're probably that 2 to 3 years at least for getting everything settled and actually a market commencing.
And since it's political based, a lot of it, obviously, we're gonna have changes in administration and leadership over that period of time.
Yep.
And so even if a lot of groundwork is done right now to get to a place where you think that you're aligned and make a decision, there's any amount of policy things that could come into
Absolutely.
play that would completely upend
Mhm.
the
It's always,
direction.
it's always a risk. And I think that's why we focus on the data and the analytics, because even if it does shift or there's substantially something different that comes to the table technically, we want to make sure we're on top of that and make sure that we're being forthright. And I think it's a really good antidote to the political part, right?
Mhm.
So, but yeah, there's no certainty here of of all this stuff penciling out.
Mhm.
And there is one other initiative we didn't mention, that's the pathways.
Oh, yeah. Pathways is a group that is basically working on that governance issue for California. They've recognized this is a good outgrowth of the competitiveness between the two markets, is that they recognize that there's a problem with governance and they have a a mounted initiative for how they could fix that in the California legislature. Ultimately, it will take legislative action to fully fix this, but they're looking at all the different solutions that they could possibly try to address that. So, yeah, if they declared a victory there, I mean, there's a possibility that that can turn around.
Mhm.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. Okay, so we're gonna cruise ahead and change topics here. Everybody's good at this, so I'll try to do this one in a little faster mode here, but this is something I've worked on for a long time. I used to work at Bonneville Power Administration, and I had a chance to work on the treaty team. It's been a really interesting project. So I worked on it since about 2012. In 2013, there was a big regional process that ultimately resulted in a regional recommendation on how the treaty should be modernized. But it's really a great example of international cooperation. Basically, they created the treaty out of concerns for repeated floods that were really damaging to the Pacific Northwest, specifically downstream in the Portland area, a place called Vanport that used to exist but was washed out in 1948 flood. That really got the attention of the U.S. saying we've got to do something. And so the United States and Canada forged this agreement in the 60s, basically to manage the river and to cooperate in management of the river, and then to share the benefits of that 50-50. That's really kind of the fundamentals. It's really about flood control and power production. And ultimately, an exchange of funds. And we could probably spend a couple of hours on this one just on its own. But bottom line is that we helped Canada build more dams, and that really has allowed them to help control the flows and manage the flows and create power. And so we do this 50-50 benefit. Now, unfortunately, they did their best to plan this treaty between the countries, but a lot of things changed. Just as you were saying a second ago about markets, you have expectations of what's going to happen, and then there's what happens, and those aren't always a matchup. And so we have seen over time that the 50-50 sharing of the coordinated benefits has actually started to creep towards Canada's favor by quite a bit. And Canada itself did recognize that. And for a while, it was a delta of about $150 million annually, meaning Bonneville was sending electricity back to Canada for what's called a Canadian entitlement. Essentially a power and an energy capacity exchange that basically would get this to 50-50. But the problem was the methodology was increasingly off. And it went from about $150 million to about $300 million annually, just because of the huge amount of value that this hydro system has in there. So the two countries have been working for a long time together, and it's been just an uphill climb. We've had turnover and different administrations, those kind of things. Both countries have had different administrations. So we did, though, finally get to a good place here. But let me just give you kind of just one more little background piece. In 2014, we could have given a 10-year notice to terminate the power provision of the treaty. That means we basically walk away from any need to coordinate on the power function. And that was always something we toyed with, but we never did issue it. I think in hindsight, people think we probably should have issued that, because it would have drawn us to the table. It would give us 10 years to figure out a plan. The other piece that was built into the treaty was prepaid flood control from the United States to Canada was set to expire September 16th, 2024, and that's happening. So in just a few days, our prepaid flood control will expire, and we don't currently have a new interim flood control plan. So we're going to be, State Department and Canada are working together right now on an agreement of principle to manage flows for the river. But between September and January, you don't usually have a flood event, but we don't really have a flood control plan between the United States and Canada right now.
Going back to the first bullet point on here, you said we didn't give notice of the intent to terminate.
Yeah.
My understanding is that only could have come from the State Department, and that there was a lot of lobbying to get the State Department to do that.
Yeah.
So isn't necessarily the utilities that didn't make that choice, but.
Yeah, that's a great point. There are a lot of political considerations for that one as well. And either country can terminate. So that trigger started in 2014. Either country could terminate or give notice for termination, and that would give you a 10-year clock. But you're right, State Department and the National Security Council ultimately have weighed in on, or the decisional elements on the treaty termination notice. And even though utilities and Bonneville and others may have an opinion, it ultimately becomes their decision, and usually consulting with the White House. Yeah. Okay, so we'll fast forward here because there's been some recent changes. So we had this 2013 regional recommendation. It included an element about a third purpose ecosystem, which was a little bit of a controversial element at the time. As I mentioned, State Department churn for almost a decade. I've met so many people at the State Department. It's been very fascinating, but it's also been very frustrating because we're training them all the time. So you're bringing them up to speed. This is where the Columbia River is. This is how it flows. This is what this is. So that's been a tough one going uphill. Okay, so let's just talk about the great change that did happen. So we basically, send 454 average megawatts of energy and 1440 megawatts of capacity north to Canada on a monthly basis. It's optimized from our 31 hydro projects and 1 nuclear project. So it doesn't matter to them if one of the projects has got a problem or any of the other issues that might be emerging environmentally. They just get what they get, and we have to figure it out. We also held out the highest value transmission to make sure to send it up through the I-5 corridor, up through Seattle area to Canada, and that's also a very congested area. And we call it the kind of the Cadillac service. It means that Bonneville has to hold that transmission no matter what, even if Canada chooses not to take it. So you've got to be at the ready if Canada pulls the trigger and wants the delivery. So it was a very good system that Canada had negotiated some to. As I mentioned, there was that inequity that grew from about 150 million to 300 million. So one of the BPA executives told me, is like, imagine our power system is a ripe watermelon. Now imagine that every month we carve out the best part, the heart, and send it to Canada. So that was really an example of what he felt like we were, basically giving away to Canada. So that's the problem with the Canadian Entitlement Exchange, is we originate it here in the Northwest. We send it up to Canada. They, of course, have got their own giant reservoirs. Another one's coming online shortly here called Site C. They're actually filling that project right now. But basically, you imagine sending that energy capacity up. And remember what I said earlier, a reservoir could be a great storage device. They can monetize that and sell it back to the United States for sometimes double, triple, quadruple the amount. So when we're at a time where we're really struggling for resources, boom, and the prices go up, that's where we see it come back down to us. So that's kind of been the challenge on that front. Okay, so we got an agreement in principle declared by both countries in July. We immediately on August 1st got a reduction in that Canadian entitlement. So 305 average megawatts of energy, 660 megawatts capacity. That's a great change for us, especially this year with a low water year. It's going to be further reduced up to 2034, the year 2034. So also really great. And then it's a funny thing, but BPA Power used to have to pay BPA Transmission to send that electricity up to Canada. We are transferring the transmission rights to PowerX, which is an arm of the Canadian government, and that saves ratepayers in the Northwest $30 million a year. So those kinds of things are kind of significant. On the other one, where we are still questioning what's going to happen next, the flood risk management, where they basically hold back 8.95 million acre feet, which is a ton of water. They can hold up that much for us on an annualized basis, now shrunk down to 3.6 million acre feet. So the Corps of Engineers says that, hey, 70% of the time, things are going to be the same as they were. We're not sure what's going to happen the other 30% of the time. So that's the part we're really working on right now. Also, there's some flows for fish and other ecosystem actions that are less known. So those are the things that we're working on. So this slide is sort of a mix of the good and then the questions that remain, and hopefully this will be penciling out. We at PPC will be watching this closely to make sure that there is not an equity or a cost transfer from the U.S. taxpayer to the ratepayer.
So that reduction in flood risk storage is going to change the power shape too.
Mm-hmm. That's what we're really concerned about, is what will that do for the power ops? And it creates more flexibility for Canada. So does that mean ultimately we're giving away?
Correct.
Yeah. So definitely a thing to watch for there. This is the last one. Okay, so that was the treaty, by the way. So that's the synopsis of the treaty and where we think we're going to be going there, but we're going to be watching that very closely. There's been some potential forecasted impacts to Grand Coulee, which in our region is one of the biggest storage reservoirs in the system. So we're very concerned about, just how that's gonna pan out in terms of any impacts to the hydro.
Which is the largest hydro project.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so really fast here on the last one, which is on the long-running salmon litigation. So again, I think any of these topics we probably could have gone faster through or gone for a session through, but this has been a really challenging one and something I, in my 30-year career, have never seen quite the kind of antics I think that have taken place. So basically, there's been long-term litigation in this basin over the operation of the Columbia River system and the related rivers. And it's really about balancing that issue of dams and fish. Now, we believe, looking at the data over the years, that the Northwest Power Act from 1980 and the resulting improvements for fish and the introduction of predation reduction programs, those kind of things, have actually helped tremendously for fish survival. So we do believe that dams and salmon can coexist. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around how these federal projects operate. Many people are even they're surprised when they hear that the Lower Snake River dams have some of the best fish passage in the world. Sometimes they believe that those dams don't have any passage at all for salmon. So there's a lot of education that still needs to take place. But the federal government recognized that there was this, long-running litigation. They said, let's do federal mediation. So they brought parties together to federally operated mediation environment, and then nobody could really talk outwardly about what was going on. This lasted for about 2 years. We were part of that at PBC, and we had a couple of other trade associations with us, but I would say it was very much an outsized stacking of stakeholders. I think you all know how important it is in McMinnville to make sure that you've got a good array of stakeholders and that there's a balance of voices in the room when there's an issue that you're taking up on policy, et cetera. This one was pretty stacked. It was pretty evident that there was that basically the federal government was in the crosshairs for dam breaching, for further operations impacts, and for further ultimately ratepayer impacts. And so it ended in late 2023, and then an agreement came out in December of 2023, December 14th. So we call it the 1214 agreement. And right away, overnight, basically with the stroke of a pen, $300 million of impact came to BPA ratepayers. So those are, ultimately ratepayers here in McMinnville. And that's on top of a $685 million a year annual program cost. Now that's a $300 million. We hope it's just a one-time hit. And that's what we're working on, is to really cap that exposure at $300 million, which is a sizable amount of money for additional fish expenses. But we're worried about what's to stop at 300 million. To your point earlier about administrations can change and others, can have new ideals. We're worried about additional agreements that could potentially come about. We're worried about this outsized aim at dam breaching when there are a lot of other things that we can definitely get benefits from, like more predation reduction, more understanding about harvest off in the ocean waters,
Ocean conditions.
and how they
Play a huge
impact
role.
salmon. Yeah. And then we're worried about de-optimizing the hydro plants further. Actually, didn't mention this earlier, but you guys were on the John Day Dam tour, and that day there was pretty heavy spill going on, and you could see the amount of spill. There's still questions about what is the right level of spill, and is there spill that can be damaging. So I think one of the things that was nerve-wracking to us and concerning to us was just how fast the US government moved without citizen involvement. And I think that's the part we're going to be really continue to focus on, is bringing more stakeholder transparency and process to these actions the US government has been taking.
So to put that 300 million into perspective, we are what, 1.2% of the BPA system?
Yes.
So that's a little over $3 million to our ratepayers.
And is that in a year's time?
Yeah, so
span?
that's a great point. It's actually 10. I think it might be there's a combination of 100 million and 200 million, but I think that the part of it is about a 20-year agreement. The other one is a shorter term that's over the 10 years. So it's a little hard to sort of say that it's not an ongoing. It's not every year. It's
And it's
one
spread out
300.
over.
It is
a
spread
period.
out. It's like a mortgage, but it's still not great.
Yeah, and what is the primary purpose? I mean, what is that 300 million?
So 300 million
dedicated for specifically?
Yeah, it's still, there's still a lot that folks are asking about what it's going to entail, but it essentially, some of it will be studying passage of salmon above Grand Coulee Dam, which is a large, as I said earlier, one of the large reservoirs. I mean, that is going to be a very interesting study because it's a very high dam. With a lot of storage value to it. So there's a lot of, and there's a lot of other fish sort of activities, basin kind of activities, habitat, those kind of things that potentially would be done. And that's on top of the annualized,
So it's not infrastructure change or dam removal or
No,
like any.
not that we,
No, it's just money earmarked to continue.
Lots of
some
studies.
protection.
There's some habitat restoration.
yeah,
there
there's,
too.
oh yeah, the Columbia Basin, the Columbia Basin agreement that's got some investments in habitat, that kind of thing, but it is still questioning, I think questionable about what we're gonna see for that ultimate investment. The 200 million of that though is for studies. It's a lot of.
So do you think that since that's earmarked and it's, I mean, it's so much money and it's earmarked for studies, do you think that sort of puts a hold on how quickly that infrastructure would change for fish purposes? Because if you're in the middle of spending 300 million or 200 million on studies, you're not gonna go change the system before you get the answers. I mean, that would,
That's logical.
Logical.
You're using logic.
Sorry.
there. Right, you're using logic.
Yeah.
I think that's the hope, right? The hope is that $300 million will keep us out of litigation and further operational impacts for 10 years at least. But there's still a lot of question about that. That's what keeps me up at night. It's just whether that's going to hold. And I think you said it earlier really well, because it applies to a lot of this stuff. Administrations change, government offices change. And so you really worry about how that might shift, could it become, what if it was an annualized agreement? I mean, these are things that we worry about because those have a direct impact to ratepayers. And yet the scientific and the mitigation actual impact is questionable.
but you could say for Pacific Northwest, because we're so hydro focused that, $300 million was spent and gave us maybe a breather on,
That's the hope.
a change
Right.
that might come more quickly if we didn't,
Yes.
if that didn't happen.
That is the hope. I think that there's a lot of folks who have a prevailing voice that the $300 million was essentially a way to guarantee some peace in the valley for 10 years or so.
And back to the base of that, the first question, that 300 mil, or the 3.2 impact to our ratepayers is spread out over 10 years, because I heard you say 10 and 20.
So I
and
think
then
200 million of it is a 20-year commitment, and 100 million is 10-year commitment. Makes sense.
Evenly spread or in lumps?
Well, in terms of how the US government is paying it out, I mean, Bonneville is actually paying it out right now in chunks. It won't be all at once. Yeah, so it will be over time.
So we should assume the same, that 2/3 of the cost to our ratepayers would be spread out over
20 years,
20 years, and 1/3 of the cost would be spread out over 10 years.
but it's still overall a 3 point something million dollar impact to
3.2.
Yeah,
our ratepayers.
yeah.
On top of this over 6 million, almost 7 million that is spent annually.
No, it's a sizable.
Yeah.
And what you get for the 685 million, I mean, I think the thing that's been really difficult is for folks to understand, and who've been proctoring this deal inside the US government, is to really have them see the $685 million a year annual program is one of the largest in the world, and it's producing a lot of great value. But I think it's the new shiny thing of wanting to do something, folks wanting to do even more studying and more investment, even without really paying attention to what we're investing in right now, if that makes sense, right? So it's sort of like, you think about, you have your whole fleet of dump trucks, but then you bought a brand new, shiny, really cool dump truck. Everybody wants to focus on that one, right? But the other ones are still really an important part of the fleet that are making a difference. And I think that's what we're really trying to make sure to do, is say, before we just add more and more expense, let's see about how some of these things that we're investing in are working. And we're even having some bottlenecks in the $685 million annual spending where they can't actually implement some of that spending. They can't implement the programs. There's not enough boots on the ground to get some of the work done.
We are at 8
Right, yep,
o'clock.
Yep,
so
that's it.
That's it. Great time.
Yeah, so I think the last part is just, so what we're trying to do, just so folks know what we're trying to do, is really fast. So just do like a 30-second wrap up here, is we're not just sitting idly. So what we're trying to do is we brought Bonneville to a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case, because that's the essentially the local, if you will, jurisdiction for Bonneville cases. So we PBC, with the support of our members, have said, can BPA be tied to this agreement? Was it legally carried out? Was it appropriately applied? We've also done the legislative efforts to try to stop the bleeding, so stop the more than $300 million from coming out of Bonneville. And then we're just really pushing for that transparency of being part of work studies and the task force and really trying to mandate more public outreach and involvement. So that's really where we're at in terms of what we're trying to ultimately do on that front. And that is the end for me.
That's great.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very good.
thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Sorry. for the fast
Don't
one.
apologize. I'm
Yeah.
gonna say, I'm gonna close the work session since it is 8:01. And then I assume if you have a few minutes or
Yeah,
questions, that would be okay for those that are able to stay on for just a second. So, great. Okay.